Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, where we dig into that age-old question. Is there a link between being super creative and mental illness? Today we're going deep into the life and work of Mary Shelley. I mean, she gave us Frankenstein, so...
She kind of launched 1,000 Gothic nightmares, right?
Pretty much.
And speaking of nightmares, there's this chilling detail from Miranda Seymour's biography of Mary Shelley. Turns out her dad...
William Godwin, the philosopher.
Yeah, exactly. He was close friends with scientists who were exploring, get this, animal electricity.
Hold on. Animal electricity. What's that all about?
So back then, this was a radical idea. They thought that nerves conducted electricity, not fluids. And we're talking...
Wait, so before Frankenstein even came out?
Decades before.
Wow, so that whole image of a creature being brought to life by electricity, it wasn't just a random thing she made up. It was like already part of the intellectual scene Mary grew up in.
Right. It makes you wonder if all that shaped how she wrote Frankenstein. Like maybe she was absorbing those ideas and weaving them into her story without even realizing it.
That's what we're going to unpack today. Did Mary's childhood, her relationships, her own inner world play into this whole mad genius thing?
Well, let's start with her childhood. I mean, talk about a unique upbringing. Mary was the daughter of two, super intellectuals, Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a feminist writer, and then William Godwin, who was all about logic and reason.
Right, but her mom died right after she was born.
Yeah. Imagine losing your mom that young, especially when your dad is, well, maybe not the most emotionally available guy.
Oh, so Godwin was one of those.
You could say that. In fact, Seymour's biography mentions how Godwin was often baffled by his late wife's passion, like he didn't really get it.
So it's like this intellectual giant who's all about logic on one side, and then Mary, this young girl, trying to deal with all these intense emotions, maybe feeling like she can't connect with her dad on that level.
And then to add fuel to the fire, Godwin went and got remarried pretty quickly.
Ouch.
Yeah, and according to Seymour, that left Mary feeling pretty displaced and resentful.
Wow, so you've got loss, abandonment, and this clash between reason and emotion, all before she's even a teenager. Sounds like a recipe for some serious inner turmoil.
No kidding, it's almost like the seeds of Frankenstein were already there, the monster who wants connection but gets abandoned by his creator. Could that be mirroring how Mary felt?
It's an interesting thought. And then you threw on the fact that she grew up during the Romantic era, which was all about embracing emotions, imagination, and the beauty of nature.
Yeah, completely different from her dad's emphasis on rationality, huh?
Talk about a clash of worldviews.
And we can't forget the historical context. The French Revolution had just happened, which was huge. People were questioning everything. Society was changing. It was a time of radical ideas, but also a lot of fear and uncertainty.
Sounds like the perfect breeding ground for both creative expression and some mental unrest, right?
Absolutely. Remember, Romanticism often glorified the outsider, the rebel, the person who challenged the norm. And both of Mary's parents were kind of rebels themselves,
They were way ahead of their time in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Pushing for equality, questioning the status quo.
Exactly. Godwin especially got a lot of flack for his radical views. He was ostracized, scrutinized by the government. So Mary was surrounded by this spirit of rebellion, but also saw the price you could pay for it.
And you could argue that that rebellious spirit is all over Frankenstein, pushing boundaries, defying nature, facing the consequences.
Right. Like she took her parents' intellectual fearlessness, but turned it into this dark and cautionary tale. It's fascinating, really. But you know what makes this even more interesting?
What's that?
Mary's relationships, especially with Percy Shelley and Lord Byron. Talk about romantic rebels.
Percy, the passionate poet who was always challenging conventions. And then there's Byron, who was like the poster child for mad, bad, and dangerous to know.
Exactly. Brilliant, but definitely volatile, always pushing the limits, living on the edge, and Mary was right there with them.
Talk about being immersed in the mad genius world.
Seriously. But let's not romanticize it too much. That lifestyle came with a heavy price. I mean, Mary and Percy lost their first child, and...
It's hard to imagine how devastating that must have been, especially back then when society was already so hard on women, especially women writers. Like the pressure she must have faced on top of everything else.
And yet she kept going. She kept writing. Think about it. Maybe writing itself, like wrestling with those dark themes, helped her cope. Maybe it was her way of dealing with all the chaos in her life.
That makes a lot of sense. It brings us back to that question of whether there's a link between creative genius and going through difficult times. Like, is facing those inner demons and putting them into art both a symptom and a way to heal?
It's like that saying, write what you know. But maybe for Mary, it was more like, write what haunts you, you know?
And maybe by doing that, she was able to turn her pain into something meaningful, something that could connect with other people who are going through their own struggles too.
It's what makes her work so powerful, so timeless. It's not just about monsters or historical drama, it's about those universal things we all face. Loss, grief, ambition, the darkness that's inside all of us.
Even the ones who think they're super rational, right?
Right, exactly. And speaking of rational minds, what about Mary's dad, William Godwin? Where does he fit into all of this?
Yeah, the champion of logic and reason. He doesn't exactly scream tortured artist.
Nope, not really. But there's this interesting tension between his belief in reason and the dark, irrational stuff Mary writes about. It's almost like she's challenging his whole worldview, like pushing back against the limits of logic.
Like she's saying, look, Dad, even the most rational person can't escape the dark side. We all have those primal urges, those dark impulses.
It's a valid point. Maybe she inherited some of her dad's intellectual brilliance, but then used it to explore the things he tried to ignore or explain away with pure logic.
It's like she took his tools of logic and reason and used them to dissect the irrational, the emotional, the things that logic just can't fully explain.
That's a great way to put it. And I think it shows just how complicated this whole mad genius idea really is. It's not just about saying all creative people are mentally ill or that being mentally ill makes you creative.
Right, it's way more nuanced than that.
Totally. Genetics, how you were raised, what you go through in life,
Oh, yeah.
even culture plays a role.
Yeah.
And Mary Shelley's story is a good reminder that we can't just label people. You know, we have to see the whole person.
Yeah, the good, the bad, the struggles, the victories, it's all part of who she was.
That's the beauty of it. Maybe by digging into the messiness, the contradictions, we can start to understand the connection between creativity and mental illness a little better.
I like that idea. So should we keep exploring? Let's delve deeper into Mary Shelley's life and what she left behind. You know, it's crazy how Frankenstein is like this warning about technology and science getting out of control. It's almost like she predicted some of the anxieties we have today.
Right. Like it was written in 1818, but it still feels so relevant. But I think that's Mary Shelley for you. She had this way of getting to the core of human fear, like the stuff that scares us, no matter what time period we're in.
I totally agree. And like we were saying before, all that stuff she went through in her own life, those early losses and her complicated family, it seems like it all found its way into her writing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's not just in Frankenstein. You see it in her other works, too.
Really? Like what?
Well, take her novel, Valperga. It came out in 1823, and it's totally different from Frankenstein on the surface. It's a historical novel set in Italy in the 1300s. Lots of political drama and power struggles.
So no monsters this time.
Not exactly. But the themes are still there. The characters are driven by ambition, by this need for control that ends up destroying them.
So even in a historical setting, she's still exploring that dark side of human nature, the dangers of wanting too much power.
Totally. It's like she's using different genres, like gothic horror and historical fiction, to say the same things about what makes us tick, what haunts us, what makes us human.
It's interesting how she keeps coming back to those same ideas, almost like she's trying to figure something out, trying to make sense of all the darkness both inside herself and in the world.
And remember, all of this is happening while she's dealing with some seriously heavy stuff in her personal life. Percy Shelley died in 1822, which left her a widow with a young son to raise.
It's just, I can't even imagine, especially back then when women, and women writers especially, were judged so harshly.
The pressure must have been unbelievable, but she kept going. She kept writing. It makes you wonder if writing was actually a way for her to cope. Maybe it was her way of dealing with all the pain and chaos.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It brings us back to that question. Is there a connection between creative genius and mental anguish? Is it possible that for some people, facing those inner demons and putting them into art is both a symptom and a way to heal? It's like that saying, write what you know, but for Mary, maybe it was more like, write what haunts you, you know?
Right. And maybe by doing that, she was able to transform that pain into something meaningful and connect with other people who were struggling with their own darkness, too.
Which is exactly why her work is still so powerful, so timeless. It's not just about monsters or historical drama. It's about those universal human experiences. Loss, grief, ambition, the shadows that are lurking beneath the surface of even the most rational mind.
Speaking of rational minds, maybe it's time we talk more about Mary's dad, William Godwin. Where does he fit into this whole mad genius conversation?
Yeah, the champion of reason and logic. He wasn't exactly the tortured artist type.
Not really. But it's interesting how his strong belief in reason clashes with all the dark, irrational stuff that Mary explores in her writing, almost like she's pushing back against his worldview. Like she's saying, hey, Dad, even logic has its limits.
Like she's saying, look, Dad, even the most rational person can't escape the dark side. We all have those primal urges, those dark impulses.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe she inherited his intellectual brilliance, but then used it to explore all the stuff he tried to explain away with pure logic, like those things that logic just can't fully grasp.
It's like she took his tools of logic and reason and used them to dissect the irrational, the emotional, the things that logic just can't fully explain.
That's a great way to put it. And I think it just shows how complex this whole idea of mad genius really is. It's not a simple equation like creative people equal mentally ill or vice versa.
Right, there's so much more to it than that.
Absolutely. It's a mix of things: genetics, upbringing, experiences, the culture you're in. Mary Shelley's story shows us that we can't just label people. We have to look at the whole person, all the different sides of them.
The good, the bad, the struggles, the triumphs, it's all part of who she was.
Exactly. Maybe by looking at the whole picture, the messiness, and the contradictions, we can start to understand the connection between creativity and mental illness in a deeper way.
I like that. So, should we keep going? Let's dive even deeper into Mary Shelley's life and the impact she had. It's amazing to think about all the strong personalities Mary Shelley was surrounded by, like her parents, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron. It's like a who's who of the Romantic era.
Right. And she wasn't just hanging out with them. She was part of the conversations, debating ideas, collaborating on projects. I mean, imagine trying to keep up with Byron and Shelley.
Talk about intimidating. How do you think those relationships shaped her as a writer? Was it inspiring or more like, oh my gosh, I can't compete with these guys?
Probably a bit of both. But it's clear she was smart, insightful, and not afraid to challenge the norm. We see that in her writing, her letters, and what people said about her back then.
She was definitely a force to be reckoned with. And yet she went through so much loss, too. Her mother, the miscarriages, the death of her first child.
It's just heartbreaking. All that grief must have been incredibly difficult to bear. But it's amazing how she used that pain, how she turned it into art.
It's like she found a way to make something meaningful out of all that suffering.
That's a really important point. You know, when we talk about the mad genius thing, we often focus on the darkness, the struggles, but we forget about the strength that can come from going through